Hi, I'm Todd McFarlane. I'm shooting this little video clip on Red Shirt Friday, October 7th, 2016, after my conversation with Trent Luce this morning on Rural Route Radio, where we were talking about the important role of county sheriffs in our system of government. What a lot of people forget is that our system of government was intended to include checks and balances. It was intended to include separation of powers. That was separation of powers between the various branches of government. That's the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And separation between the federal, state, and local government. And checks and balances between all of them. And in that overall scheme of government, the office of county sheriff is very important. And the important thing to understand is that the county sheriff is the elected official in his county who is the highest law enforcement officer. He has more power in that county than anyone else in the country. He has more power in his county under the Constitution than the President of the United States. One of the things that we need to understand is that the Constitution spells out the role and the powers of the federal government. And it spells out that the federal government will have a limited role. No one's arguing that there shouldn't be a federal government. No one's arguing that the federal government doesn't have very important roles. But what many people do argue, and I tend to agree, is that the federal government often tries to act outside of those roles, tries to expand its reach, tries to overreach. And so what the Constitution says is that the federal government has these limited powers, but all the other powers are reserved to the states and to the people under the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment is intended to clearly clarify and express that position, that all the other powers are reserved to the states and to the people. And when it comes to many of the issues that we're talking about, it's the county sheriff that has responsibility. It's the county sheriff that a lot of times has responsibility for interacting with the federal government. Out here in the West, where we deal so much with federal lands and resources, it's important to understand that under FLPMA, the Federal Lands Policy Management Act, the federal government is required to coordinate with local government. And the county sheriff plays a very important role with respect to that coordination, both in terms of law enforcement and for other reasons. But I think this is an important conversation to be having this year, because this is an election year in a lot of local rural counties in the West, as it is in Harney County, Oregon, where we've been paying a lot of attention this year. And there's an active local county sheriff's race there this year. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I live in a county here in Utah where we had a county sheriff who was in office for almost 30 years. And during that time period, he often talked about this conflict between the federal government and state and local government with respect to these land use issues. And he often talked about that he would resist some of the efforts that they were making at federal overreach. And one of the things I often said at that time was, his mettle had never been tested. He talked the good talk, but he'd never been given an opportunity to really walk the walk. Well, that's one thing about Harney County and Sheriff David Ward this year. He's been given the opportunity to both talk the talk, walk the walk, and his mettle has been tested with respect to these issues. And I think he's shown his true colors. Nothing that I've seen so far pointed this out to me like the title of an article in Redoubt News. And I'll post a link to that. I encourage you to look at it. But basically the title was, Skittish Sheriff Turns Burns into War Zone. And then it had pictures of the courthouse that was barricaded and all of that stuff. And I think that really sums up what happened with Sheriff Ward. He was so skittish, he was so scared of Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne that the first thing he did was turn straight to the federal government. He removed all separation of powers. He removed all checks and balances that are supposed to exist. He went straight to the federal government, and he basically became putty in their hands in terms of working through and resolving this situation. And I think that to a large degree, and I think Governor Kate Brown did exactly the same thing. But we're talking here about the role of sheriff. So Sheriff David Ward became actively involved in the ultimate result, which resulted in Lavoy Finicum being killed and all of the other things that have happened. There was not, from my perspective, a real, genuine, effective effort to negotiate and work out some kind of other resolution. I know that Ammon Bundy and the other occupiers were working on an exit strategy. The problem is Sheriff Ward was not part of that. He didn't want to be part of that. He wanted to just play the role and be the putty in the federal government's hands. So my point is this. In Harney County, I think Sheriff Ward has had the opportunity to have his mettle tested this year. He's shown his true colors. He's up for re-election anytime in any political race, local or otherwise, and I've been involved in a lot of political activism, especially local political activism over the years, and I say anytime an elected leader does that and they show their true colors and their record speaks for itself, my phrase is, by their fruits ye shall know them. By Sheriff Ward's fruits, you know what he's going to do. He's not interested in separation of powers. He's not interested in checks and balances. He's interested in being putty in the federal government's hands. He's been given the opportunity to have his mettle tested, to show his true colors, and I encourage you in Harney County to elect a new sheriff. You need a sheriff who will stand up for you. As far as I can tell, Sheriff Ward did nothing to stand up for the Hammonds. He could have used his office, not to disobey federal court orders or anything like that, but he could have used his office, he could have used his power, he could have used his jurisdiction to try to protect his local residents, the Hammonds, and protect their interests. And it would be my position that that's what his office is intended to do, but he chose not to do that. And I hope you'll take that into consideration this year in the election. I encourage you to elect a new county sheriff. I encourage you to elect Alan Johnson. I think of those two choices, Sheriff Ward has demonstrated what he'll do. Candidate Johnson is experienced. Let's give him a chance. And we don't know what he'll do when his mettle is tested, but let's give him an opportunity to let that happen.